Nancy Agabian. Welcome to the Writers Center. Welcome to our virtual craft chat, where we talk to others a little bit less about what they wrote and a little more about how you wrote it. So I'm going to ask you to start by reading a few pages from your absolutely riveting novel, The Fear of Large and Small Nations.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Writers Center, for having me. I'm so honored to be in this space and have this time to be able to connect with you all. I thought I would read from the first couple of pages. I haven't actually done that yet at a reading event.
Do it twice. No, don't do it twice, but
This is from the prologue, and the title of the prologue is Motherland. And it starts with an epigraph by the poet Silva Gabudikian. Look, my child, wherever you are, wherever you go under this moon, even if you forget your mother, do not forget your mother tongue. I don't remember the first time I saw Mother Armenia wielding her heavy sword across her narrow hips. It was likely from a distance, while walking the streets in the center of Yerevan, that I initially glimpsed her blocky military figure, an upright soldier guarding me from her perch above the city. Eventually, I ascended the hill where she stood and learned that she had replaced a statue of Stalin in the 60s, and that her likeness was inspired by actual Armenian mother warriors. But most of the time, her stark figure hovered in the back of my consciousness, never really engaging my imagination. Instead, my preferred symbol of the motherland was an apparition named Fimi, whom I encountered during the final hours of my very first trip to Armenia. She appeared in the middle of the night, an otherworldly vision among the stray dogs that regularly wandered the outskirts of the cafes by the opera. I wouldn't have noticed her if Gharib hadn't announced, "Oh, look who is here," as Fimi glided toward our patio table under an umbrella of light. She was wearing a little rhinestone crown pinned into the nest of reddish hair piled atop her head, and her face was framed by spit curls that twirled at her temples. Bright red lipstick lit up her lips, and blue eyeshadow arched over her lids. She wore a white fur capelet over a glittering baby blue brocade dress with chunky costume jewelry clustered on her fingers, up her arms, and around her neck. With a boozy smile, Fimi stepped further into the light, and I could see that her capelet was dingy and her jewelry was tarnished with gemstones missing. Had I encountered her alone on the streets, I might have guessed she was a prostitute. Taking cues from my friends as we sat near the opera, I regarded her as an artist. It seems odd to call the people at the table my friends when I'd been in Yerevan merely a week, but I did feel close to them. In Armenia, even as people struggled and subsisted, it was impossible not to feel embraced and nurtured. I had been invited to participate in a feminist conference, along with a handful of visiting artists and intellectuals from Europe. The Armenians had taken us in as their own, feeding us, leading us on tours, welcoming us into their homes, and imparting their unique sense of togetherness, going so far as to stay up all night to shepherd us to the airport in the early morning. For the few hours left before my flight brought me back to New York, I was a member of a family of Armenian artists in exile from their sleeping counterparts. The cafe was the kind of commercial venture once loathed during the advent of capitalism after the Soviet collapse, but now begrudgingly accepted at the time in 2005. More than a few people had lamented that this area was once a beautiful park during the Soviet era before its current iteration as a string of overpriced tourist traps. The complaints didn't preclude anyone from spending hours at a time smoking and drinking once they plopped into a patio chair, though. The artists had collectively decided this was the least objectionable establishment based on its lower prices and less boorish waiters. They now passed Mother Armenia a glass and poured her some cognac. Fimi was unlike any woman in Armenia I had seen. All week I had been confronted by conformity on the streets of Yerevan, armies of thin young virgins in uniforms of long dark hair, sleek skirts, and high heels. Scattered among them were the matrons who had already raised their children, wearing boxy leopard print blouses and shapeless black skirts, their unkempt hairdos a rainbow of hues and gray roots. The women of transitional age, like me, lacked a visible presence, probably because they were caring for children in their homes or working long hours in menial jobs, or both, which I had learned about at the feminist conference. Fimi seemed to belong to another class entirely, the international tribe of artists. It turned out she was a singer, though not an operatic one. She professed to love music from all cultures, entertaining us with songs in Russian, Arabic, Ladino, Georgian, and Armenian. With her sweet, deep, and soulful voice, she performed passionately, twirling her arms and pushing her bosom toward the moon. Luckily, Fimi knew a little English. In between songs, she told me her story. I am hated, she said, because I'm so different from everyone. And I'll close there on that moment.
Okay, people, buy the book. Okay, buy the book. I was absolutely mesmerized and forgot that I'm supposed to be leading this chat, but thank you for sharing that. There's so much I want to dig into about. Okay, all right, let's start with a standard writer-centered question. In your own words, who the heck are you?
So I'm someone who doesn't do well with humidity. So forgive me for if I seem a little lagging. I'm the kind of person who gets nervous doing these talks, even though I've done a lot of them over the years. And I'm also lead a life as a writing instructor and professor. But I would say that I'm a creative person, that creativity is one of the main ways I survive and thrive in the world and interact with it. I'm also a crocheter. Besides,
I've started knitting. Okay, we'll talk about that after, but yes.
I find it very meditative and healing. I grew up in Massachusetts and lived my adult life in big cities in LA and New York, and recently returned pre-pandemic to take care of my parents who have dementia, and my mom passed away almost a year ago. So I'm also a caregiver. I take care of my dad. But I did want to mention my mom in terms of creativity because she was an arts educator and gave me an incredible arts education as a child. And as I've been grieving her and in this aftermath of her life and honoring her life and realizing just how much art and creativity was a balm for her and that it was a healing space. And that's true for me too. But I'm also political. My birth as a writer happened in 1990 when I was in a multicultural poetry workshop for women led by Michelle T. Clinton in Venice at a place called Beyond Baroque, a literary arts center. And in that space, I was really encouraged to write about my cultural background, as was everyone. We were encouraged to think about our writing as a means to combat racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. And I still practice that, and I also teach that.
So,
yeah, and go ahead. I was going to talk a little bit about myself as a writer, but to talk about my writing. I was just going to say, as an author, I've written 3 books, so a poetry collection, a memoir, and now this novel. And they all center around the intersections and the lived experience of Armenian American queer and feminist identity. So, for example, my memoir, the previous book, I wrote about my grandmother's survival of the Armenian genocide of 1915 within my own queer coming of age story. And now this recent book, writing about Armenian diaspora identity, it came about as I was visiting my estranged homeland. It was estranged because my grandparents weren't from there. They had fled Ottoman era Turkey. Also estranged because had been part of the Soviet Union, and I was seeing all these post-Soviet echoes, which you heard a little bit in the excerpt I read. But visiting Armenia was this strange mix of encountering history and trauma and displacement, but also creativity and cultural joy at a very pivotal time when people were in the act of building their country.
So if I could interrupt, so you're talking about diaspora, and so I want to get into the structure of this book, which is really interesting, but also the layers of Armenian culture, and so if you can explain for people the concept of diaspora and what that means and why that's so important, both in the book and in your life. From what I know of people I'm just going to end my sentence awkwardly.
I think so. I grew up, my parents were born in the US, but children of immigrants and refugees. And so I was really raised with learning the history of Armenia, especially the genocide that I learned about through my grandmother. And so this strong feeling of responsibility to uphold Armenian culture when it had been attempted to be destroyed in 1915 by Turkey. So that's a bit about the concept of diaspora, that the main character, Natalee, or Na, is much like me. It actually is an autobiographical novel. It is based on my experiences in Armenia. She goes to Armenia to explore her heritage, and finds it difficult to learn the language, finds the echoes of intergenerational trauma, but also trauma from the Soviet Union, trauma from a war in 1991 to 1994, and definitely has an Armenian American identity, and finds herself feeling like she doesn't quite belong, and belonging becomes a big part of her journey.
So let's talk about the issue of writing an partially, or I don't know if to say partially or entirely Armenian story, but writing for a Western audience. The questions of how do you, there's a lot of history that you've imparted, even the last few minutes, which, as I said to you, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that a lot of Americans don't know Armenian history, don't know about genocide, should but don't. So how did you, as you're crafting this story, balance what was happening in the narrative with the need to recognize this is a Western audience who doesn't know what you're talking about? How did you decide, like, how to balance the didacticism? I just said that to be smart, but the didacticism with the narrative, because I thought you did it beautifully, but how did you do that?
Thank you. I think one thing, and I think it comes out in the excerpt, was one thing that drew her, the main character, Na, to Armenia, was this sense of togetherness that she observes. She feels like she doesn't experience that in Western culture, that relationships with family and friends become really centered. And I think her navigation of that forces her to delve into some of the history. Wherever she kind of sees a difference between her and what she's experiencing in Armenia, she's forced to pull it apart and make sense of it.
But as a writer, how did you decide? Sorry to interrupt, but that's what I do. Apologies. So how did you decide when to explain something to the Western audience? Did you decide?
Well, I guess I feel it's a Western story to go to a country and notice a difference in culture. But it's also one thing that she was experiencing was, like I mentioned, the responsibility of upholding the culture. I think a lot of immigrants and immigrant families feel a cultural loss in the US. And I think that's a Western story too. But to answer your question in terms of how I made the decisions to explain, it was hard because there is a lot of Armenian history, and as a writer, I feel like I've progressed through it in previous works. And so I didn't want to, delve too deep, but just try to give enough that it would give people a grounding, that if they needed to seek out more info, that hopefully the storytelling would inspire them to look up more.
And I mean, that's just, a personal interest of mine is the question of where you're writing a story that's a broader story. Like, what do you explain? What do you just assume people can take from context? So how did you make those decisions? Was it you? Was it editors? And then I'm going to pull off this topic to a lot of other questions, but
well, I guess it helps to hear a little bit about kind of the structure of the book, because I think that might answer the question.
That was going to be my next question, is can we pull back to describe the really unique structure, what it is and how you decided to do that, and why?
Yeah, so I think if I answer that, it could lead into the decisions about giving the history and context. So to explain a bit about the protagonist's journey, she's making her way in Armenia, she has this goal to interview artists and activists and feminists to learn about social change in Armenia after the Soviet collapse. And she finds herself with roadblocks and has somewhat of an emotional meltdown and witnessing really strict gender roles. And as I said, really struggling with the language. It affects her more than she anticipated it would. And she ends up falling for a very young, charismatic guy, not as bisexual and feminist, and she falls for this young man who is also bisexual.
He's pretty compelling. He's pretty compelling.
Really charismatic, yeah, poet and a punk rocker, and she feels like he really sees her, but he's facing conscription in the army, which has been known to be really brutal, especially if you're somehow different. And she takes it upon herself to quote unquote rescue him, decides to marry him, and they move to New York together. So the story is told in each chapter includes a blog post from what she's witnessing and seeing in Armenia, and jumps forward in time to her journal entries describing what's turning into this very abusive relationship in New York. And she finds herself wondering, how did I get here? Looking back on her time in Armenia, writing about herself in sections that are called story sections that are written in the third person, and then also some meta writing passages where she pulls all these fragments together to create a story and make sense of how she's wound up where she is and how she's going to try to get herself out of this situation. So to answer the first question, those blog posts, I do think does a lot of the heavy lifting of the contextual historical stuff, because it's a place for her to explain to friends and family back home what she's witnessing, what she's going through. So it's already kind of this explanatory space.
So, and I will just say for the people who should buy the book, and you should buy the book, that the sections are not only different points of view and tenses, but also different fonts. So I was particularly interested in the meta writing sections because I've never seen that anywhere. Could you explain that for our listening audience?
Sure. Like they initially started out, initially I intended this book to be nonfiction, actually. I wanted it to be a reported book about what I had seen and witnessed in Armenia the year that I lived there in 2006. And as I was working on it a few years later, I found myself writing about this relationship, not knowing if it fit. And my writing group at the time, I was concerned it was going to take away from the themes I was trying to get into about gender and power and privilege and the social change I saw underway. And they saw connections between the personal story and the social or public story, and they encouraged me to keep writing. So I had these blog posts, and I was trying to write kind of this reported story.
Excuse me. So the blog posts in the story existed beforehand, and then you integrated them?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then I was also integrating journal entries into it. Oh. And then what I found was I wasn't able to hold it together until I wrote in the third person, because it helped me to step back get some distance from some of the difficult issues I was writing about. And then the meta writing came along it helped me figure out what I was doing as a writer. So
can you describe what that is for people, please?
Meta writing's writing about writing. So it's where you kind of figure out what you're doing in the writing.
Like for the reader to read. Well,
initially, no, but that's basically, once I wrote in third person, it gave me permission to fictionalize the other passages. So although the meta writing started as kind of an explanation to myself, it started to morph into an explanation to the reader. Like the passage I just read is an example of the meta writing. She's kind of explaining why she decided to go live in Armenia for a year after this week that she lived there. But it also gave me a space to allow the character to reflect. I came to see, as a writer, I came to see those meta writing passages as reflective passages, that it gave room for the narrator to say, this is how I see why I was so ashamed of the situation that I was in. This is how I see shame in Armenian culture. And that doing that helped to build the story.
Oh, absolutely. So okay, so you have these threads. You have the short story, or the story as you call it, the blog posts and the meta writing. And how did you write this book? Let's go back to day one. You had an idea? I mean, how the heck did you create this?
Yeah, so as I said, it was, like I said, it was intended to be a nonfiction book. And I'd had all this material through the blog posts, and I started trying to craft chapters around themes. And once I pasted together a chapter, I'd bring it to my writing group, a group of 3 wonderful women writers, also working on stories about homeland, also, navigating between fiction and nonfiction, and they'd give me feedback, and I just kept moving through. And I saw kind of themes come up as I was writing, as I was going along. And I, once I had a critical mass of pages, I, then kind of took to it to cut it apart, move things around. Some things that were blog posts got turned into stories. One concern I had was that the story of abuse was very dark and heavy. And so it was important to me that the blog posts could often really tonally shift things and give the reader a break, while the meta writing could also, I've had readers tell me that they knew the narrator was okay by how she was analyzing and reflecting on her story, that they could keep reading. And so those were the sort of issues I had in mind as I kept kind of cutting and pasting and deciding what should go where. And that is generally my process, is like I just overwrite. I like write a big block of marble.
Go big.
I don't know where I'm going, and then I can look at it and take my chisel or whatever and take away what doesn't need to be there and find where the pieces should fit together.
So Emily, just please, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. I will get to them. But I also getting back to that question of threads in the book. So you have threads of sexuality, ethnicity, identity, these very strong threads that so you've got these disparate formats, not disparate, just different formats of fonts and styles, but you've also got these threads. So this is really like, I'm going to do a thing with my fingers here that doesn't make sense, but right, you've woven together this 3-dimensional, like, how did you weave the threads that you're talking about I've written down sexuality, ethnicity, identity, but there's more to it. But how did you make that into a whole?
That they gradually emerged. So, like I said, from that block of marble, I'd see where a theme was emerging and try to pull it out and use it to connect. And the meta writing was good for that. And sometimes I like to say this is a creative nonfiction writer's novel, because I couldn't let go of that reflective kind of writing that we do in nonfiction. The first kind of most prominent theme that emerged was this one of change, like Armenia was in the midst of change and is desperate for change. There's a lot of corruption after the Soviet Union has collapsed. And Na desperately wants change. She's in this terrible, destructive relationship and she can't get out of it and can't figure out why she's so stuck. So though that kind of emerged to help me as I went along. And then the next kind of theme, as I was going through another revision, shame emerged as a main theme that, she eventually starts reading about narcissism and the kind of codependent narcissistic dynamic between her and this guy. And that becomes sort of a lens into seeing shame within Armenian culture. And that became something that I felt important to bring out. And then finally, I got to a point of feeling like as the story progressed and she kind of realizes her strength, it's through thinking about vulnerability. And Armenia is a very vulnerable country of 3 million people, landlocked, surrounded by hostile neighbors. And then I, did another revision thinking about that theme. And there are sub-themes within those.
There are.
And you mentioned some of them. So it was a process of, revising multiple times. It took me about 6 years to have a finished draft, and multiple drafts of revisions, looking at the book through these different lenses that helped me pull out the story and the themes.
So the questions are coming in the chats. Thank you, Emily, for reminding everybody that your questions are more interesting than mine. So I want to get to, because one of the great things about these craft chats is the chance for participants to talk to you about this incredible book. So Jackie asks, thank you for the space to ask a question. I am delighted to have this space. How do you feel that your story empowers Armenian women? While writing, were you hoping to empower Armenian women to feel comfortable with their sexuality and identity no matter what?
Oh, that's a great question.
Isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's ironic. This character is kind of complex and complicated in that she goes to Armenia as a feminist, but really finds the limits of her feminism. And I think in sort of finding, like kind of refinding her commitment to feminism through the relationships with Armenian women, that is an empowering story. And I don't know that I thought so much of it as, oh, this story's going to empower other women. Maybe I just don't think in that term. I thought of it more as hopefully it can, I guess when I read books and read about a tender or vulnerable character, I feel like it gives me that space to be tender and vulnerable. And I hope that's what it gives, that getting to that place can often help us unpack certain difficult places in our life and find something relatable. So I hope by example, by some of the stories in the book, that it does give empowerment. And yeah, definitely to feel to feel maybe empowered to reach out to others for support. That's something that the narrator went through.
So, the words tender and vulnerable are just rolling in my head. I wish I'd used those earlier because there's so much in the book. That is that. Valeriana asks, was your novel inspired at all by Armenian literature or literature from the region?
A little bit. You know, I'm a big fan of Zabelia Sayan, and she was just this incredible witness to the Armenian genocide, but also to writing about Armenian women's lives in the 19th century, early 20th century. But I would say I was more so inspired by what I saw at the time that I was there in 2006 to 2007, what artists were doing at the time, the collage. Often I call this like fragmented book. I sometimes call it a collaged book. And I was seeing a lot of collage among the artists in Armenia at the time. It felt like a way to artists were using different source materials from different time periods to represent themselves. And that felt like something that it inspired me, that I wanted to borrow from. It felt like it could, the book could help reflect that reality of change being underway and trying and grasping at different ideas that weren't always available to them in order to make change.
Thank you. Another question, I'm not sure, it looks like Gil, I apologize if I mispronounce what I'm reading. Were there challenges in writing autobiographical fiction? Oh, always so interesting to me, given that the line with memoir can become challenging. If you can you give an example where a scene or a memory where you fictionalized from what was actually happening? Or where you didn't? I'll throw that in for myself.
I need to take a little
take your time.
moment to think about that.
Please.
I don't want to do any spoilers, but
no, you have to buy the book. You want to know what she's talking about, you have to buy the book. And write reviews.
But I would say, because it's an autobiographical novel, that the fiction came in when I needed to piece together the plot. So there were times when I needed to fictionalize just in order for the story to make sense. So I can't think of a specific scene where, you know, there's one scene where she describes meeting a guy on the street who, she's lost and she's trying to find her way and she's asking people to help her. And this homeless guy says, I'll help you. And he takes her, she knows he's taking her in the wrong direction. And she ends up feeling very ashamed about that he clearly just kind of wants a meal. He brings her to a restaurant. She's like, I'm sorry, I've got to go. Later on, I wrote a scene in a chapter about, there's this beautiful part of Yerevan called the Cascade that's filled with beautiful fountains. And she talks with a friend at that location. She sees a statue of a character from Armenian mythology called Sasunsi David, who's an orphan boy who is like a David and Goliath story. And he has a cup at his foot that when it overflows, it's supposed to represent the impatience of the Armenian people overflows. And that's when Sasunsi David's going to fight his huge enemy. But it's been stolen. The cup's actually been stolen for scrap metal. So there's no water coming out of it. And so the narrator kind of reflects on this. It's at the train station, and the train that goes to Georgia, which is normally, maybe a 3-hour train ride, becomes like a 12-hour train ride. And she reflects on the immense patience of the Armenian people. So later in the chapter, she's like putting all these threads together about patience and oppression. She has a dream about a fire hydrant in New York City. And
as we all do.
And that's a little fictional element I put in. So the Cascade, a real place, the interaction with the homeless guy, that happened to me. Sasunsi Davud, a real statue, but then adding in this little fictional element of this dream about a fire hydrant, and hearing the story of this homeless man, that he was a soldier in this war with Afghanistan, giving her more empathy and understanding of what his plight is. That's an example of a little bit of a fictional element that tied in with imagery of the water and the patience, etc.
So Samantha has a question about your publishing journey, which I was going to get to anyway myself, because I'm always interested in your path to publication. So Samantha says, as someone who has written a novel set half outside the US in a small country, she's had trouble finding a home for her novel. Welcome to the world of writing. But she's inspired by your story. Can you talk a little bit about your path to publication?
Thank you. Yeah, I would say don't give up, that these stories that people want to hear these stories of other places. It was so inspiring to me to see another reality, and to also understand the influence of the US, a very huge, powerful country in a small country. But the publishing story is that I decided to complete, like, as I said, I'd worked on it for 6 years and I was nearing completion, and I saw there was a deadline for the Penn Bellwether Prize for socially engaged fiction. And I thought, I'm going to use that deadline to complete this novel. And I sent it in, and it became a finalist. And I, was shocked, overwhelmed, excited, affirmed. I felt like, okay, this is doing something. And that's when I decided to seek out an agent. And that process took a while. I think I queried 35 agents before I found one who
Excuse me, just for the writers in the audience, that is not a lot of agents to query. 100, 150, that's normal. That's great.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I had friends who had found agents after 10 query
Oh,
letters.
come on.
So,
For heaven's sake.
but I feel like this process becomes more and more difficult every year. And that, yeah, you're right about 100, but in 2016, when I was querying, I don't think 100 was the standard.
Fair.
But I thought he was a really great fit. Looking at his other books, I was excited to work with him. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to sell it. And that's when I was reaching out to indie presses. And in the midst of that, got invited to contribute to an anthology by a new press, Nauset Press, which is the press that published the novel. I had a great experience with this
hang on, I'm gonna throw that link in there.
Sure.
Okay. Go ahead. Sorry. There we go.
So I had a great experience with this anthology. It was called Fierce. The concept was for women writers to write about women who were lost to history. And actually, I wrote about Zabelia Sayan, the writer that I mentioned previously. And just I wondered if, given my good experience with that anthology, if the publisher would be interested, and she was, and had an incredible experience working with her. She actually designed the book, so the multiple fonts were her vision. I had written it in just one font and used italics here and there, and she really made it into a beautiful book. But she also helped me conceive of the whole project. There was a way that this format of the 4 threads needed a little bit of a push, and she helped me with that a lot. So I guess my advice is to keep seeking out, try everything you can to find an agent. Know that there are independent presses who are interested and invested in stories like this. And I think there's also so much to gain from exploring independent presses and the work that they're putting out.
Oh, absolutely. So Nancy, we only have a few minutes left, and I have 3 questions I want to get to. 1 from the chat and 2 from me. So
I'll try to be short.
Oh, I will too, which is my least favorite thing because I like to talk. Okay, from Asa, were you encouraged to write and influenced by the famous and popular Armenian writers William Saroyan and Ross Bagdasarian? Is our culture of writing and performing among Armenian Americans?
Yeah.
That gets to me again to the diaspora question, which is, in my experience from Armenian friends, quite strong.
Yeah, definitely. So many Armenian American writers I've been inspired by, and Armenian writers. I actually don't know Ross Bagdasarian's work, but for sure William Saroyan. I think also inspired by Arlene Avakian's book, Lion Woman's Legacy, which was a beautiful memoir about coming of age in the 40s and 50s as a lesbian, and working really in intensely in the civil rights movement in the US. That was a big influence on me. George Sambolian, who was a pioneer of LGBTQ literature, and his work was a big inspiration. Nancy Agabian, who's written a trilogy of books about Armenian Americans and Armenians in the diaspora in France, and now has a book coming up soon about Armenians in Beirut. We Armenians have so many stories across the globe, especially Armenians who fled to Beirut after the genocide have created such incredible work. Shahé Mankarian, the poet, Arthur Kaizakian, I've been learning about his work, who is from Iran. So this kind of tapestry of voices is incredibly inspiring. Alvin and the Chipmunks, I thought that name was familiar. I didn't know he was also a writer.
Okay, I don't understand that at all. I mean, I do know Alvin the Chipmunk. What?
Alvin and the Chipmunks was created by an Armenian record producer. Yeah.
I have so much Googling to do.
If you remember them, I don't know if everyone here will remember them.
Alvin. Okay. All right. This is being recorded, so I won't do my impersonation, but I think my sister is on this Zoom right now, and she knows I can bring it with Alvin and the Chipmunks. So, okay. Okay, Jackie, thank you for the references. 2 more questions. This is, so Nancy, you've done a lot of promotion for this book, which everyone should read and buy and review. What is a question you have not been asked about your writing that you would like to answer?
That's such a nice question. I wish someone would ask me what other disciplines have inspired your writing.
I will ask you that now. Pretend I asked you that. Go for it. That's a good question.
So visual art and performance art. So, another element of the collage, I think I was already kind of predisposed to it from being a performance artist. That form of storytelling where you have to shift gears in front of a live audience and work in different modes, like work in dance or a monologue, and work outside of kind of traditional theater. That kind of predisposed me to write in this collage style. I think and also there's a bit of performance art in the novel itself. It takes a place in the storytelling. And then the visual art, I mentioned already a bit that the visual artists in Armenia had inspired me with their work in collage, but also there are these statues and beautiful, like, monuments, Armenian churches from the 17th, 16th, 15th century, statues around Yerevan. These kinds of this visual art was very inspiring to me in writing this story, in capturing the place. But also I think it inspired my editor too. She's also a visual artist, and she was intrigued with the places mentioned in the book and offered to create these illustrations at the top of every chapter.
So thank you. We have time for one more question, but if the chat wants to rage about the chipmunks, have at it. So Nancy, thanks for your time. What is one piece of advice you have for writers just starting out?
I feel like writing the story you need to tell is the one that we need to hear. If you haven't seen it represented somewhere else, there's probably reasons for it. There are probably systemic reasons. And we need to learn about those reasons, and your personal story has the heart and will give meaning to those kinds of experiences. So I would say if you can get to the, the tender story, the one that you need to get off your chest, exploring that is going to be a meaningful route for you, but also for your reader.
And that's a wrap. These are all the questions I didn't get to. So Nancy, thank you so much for joining us. People, buy the book, write reviews, and then send me an email, amy.freeman@writer.org, to say thank you for recommending that book.